Good afternoon and welcome to the Takeup. Today we have episode 144, The Path to Learning Embroidery Digitizing. Good afternoon, folks, and welcome to the Takeup and happy Education Friday to you guys. As we come up to show season kicking back off, for me, I am certainly in the mind to think about education, to think about teaching digitizing, learning digitizing, and honestly, to think about you guys who are out there doing the work, getting started, because I'm going to be talking about that a lot in the new week as we come up. It's DAX show season. DAX is coming up. I am heading off to teach. Coming up next Thursday, you'll see that I am off teaching my intermediate course on embroidery digitizing, trying to expand on the basics. And so this is definitely something that I'm thinking about a lot. And in this last couple weeks, I have been getting increasing questions from people asking, hey, how do I get into embroidery digitizing? I'm starting from X point. I want to figure out how to get there. I want to figure out how to figure my way into the process. And what does that pathway look like? And I thought, honestly, as much as I tell you guys how to learn embroidery digitizing, how I learned embroidery digitizing, the truth of the matter is there are more than one way of coming about this thing. There's more than one way to come to it. And in being someone who teaches embroidery digitizing, who teaches embroidery in general, and who happens to be someone who learned without education like this, without direct teaching, I know that the way I learned and the way I teach are actually quite different. So it's something that's worth talking about. So between that and the fact that I'm dealing with folks who are from lots of different styles of execution, there are people who have started out from the embroidery process like I did, where they got their hands onto the hoops, they got themselves working with materials and stabilizers and threads and machines very early, and are working from there. And there's folks who are coming in from the design side where they're saying, hey, I came in working on these kinds of artwork. I have this kind of file that I'm working on. I draw vector. I'm a designer. And I want to know how to go from there into the world of embroidery, into the world of digitizing. And I realize these are very different things for different people. So what I'm hoping for is that we can kind of talk about that and kind of make it clearer that though there are different ways to come to this thing, that, they're both equally valid ways to get here, and that there's different ways that we can kind of approach it. However, I will certainly still say that I recommend certain kinds of not only certain kinds of experiences, certain kinds of processes to anyone who's coming through the embroidery process. I mean, I think that the first thing to say is no matter what you do, I feel like embroidery is so holistic. It requires you to understand all of its different moving parts, that you need to have experience in all of them to do your best work, that there are certainly things that are pros and cons of different ways of going about it. And that there are things that I did in my education that most certainly might not be what you need to do or what I would even ask you or want you to do. So here's the thing. In order to make this clearer, to kind of have this discussion, make it fun, and to have kind of a short, light show that brings you into this concept and kind of lets you talk also about your experiences learning, I'm going to talk a little bit about how I came to be an embroidery digitizer. You guys may have heard that if you've been on the show for some period of time, you've been hanging around stuff that I've taught before or any of my classes. You may know a little bit about me and about how I got here, but we'll talk about that, about how I came in. I'm going to talk about some of the practices that I recommend and some of the things that I usually teach from. And I'll just discuss kind of the process, the pros and cons, and discuss what I think can be beneficial about starting in a particular side of this thing, whether you're starting in the embroidery side, whether you're starting in the design side, or honestly, the other kind of two start points that I see competing to some degree, or at least that make a difference. I started wholeheartedly in the commercial world. I started my embroidery journey on commercial equipment, working at a functioning shop. So I was working at a mid-sized functioning shop on multi-head equipment. That's how I started. So it is a very different way of starting than what I would consider either the small shop option or the craft option, where you start by embroidering on your own smaller equipment and you have a different skill set. And I think there's pros and cons to all of these, and it's something that's worth discussing. And I'm going to talk about at least how I feel about all of that, as well as discussing kind of my opinions of it and my history. So hopefully this will be something that's interesting for you guys. I would really love it if you're here, if you're watching live, please jump in the comments, share with me how you have learned about embroidery. How have you learned digitizing? What are your practices? What have you find the most helpful? Because I will definitely clue into that, check in with you folks, and talk live with those of you who are here live, discussing your experiences as well. But as you can see from what I threw up in the original banner here, I've got my thumbnail so you can see it. I'll show you these pictures in a little bit better detail, a couple of them. But I've been doing digitizing and embroidery since quite some time. And this is actually not only not my first setup that you see in the center of this thumbnail, but it's a setup that I had kind of later on down the road. I'm already on really good, capable software. But originally, this is not what I had. But they were huge CRT machines. And like I said, the monitors on these, big CRT monitors, fairly low resolution. But by the time I'm on these big monitors and running a 2 monitor system, I actually have quite a bit of resolution, and I'm well into my career. My first setup was not that good. It was really not only low graphical density on those monitors that I had. Not only is it low definition in that case, but we had only a few colors you could describe. It would only show 16 colors. It was DOS based, which meant I didn't have a normal windowing system. The system that I had didn't draw curves, didn't have all the automation that we have now. And a lot of what I had to do had to be done manually. But the funny thing about that is, I think that kind of informs my digitizing now, and it freed me from some of the traps that I see folks coming in a more modern fashion. And I think that's something that is interesting to talk about as well. But as I am wont to do, I thought I would go ahead and give you guys a little bit of additional material. So if you want additional material about practice and embroidery, a lot of you guys like to come back and read stuff later on down the road that is interesting to you. I'm going to go ahead and show you a couple links from stuff that I think would be useful. If you want to talk about embroidery practices, in the last year, I did a piece for Graphics Pro. So Magazine Graphics Pro, who I have written for and I'm going to be writing for again here shortly, these folks put out a 2-part digital series that I put up called Goals and Practices in Embroidery. There's a part 1 and a part 2 to this one. So I'm going to go ahead and show you links and everything else that you might need to get to it. But so far, this is part 1. And here's a link for part 1. I'll throw this up as a QR code as well, so you can get a chance at that. If you are watching this with your phone in your hand, you can snap that QR code in the corner. This is part 1. But this piece is talking about goal setting. So if you're somebody who wants to learn more about embroidery, who's already started and you're trying to get into personal practice, something that I highly recommend you do, creating your own designs, creating designs that are personal to you, that don't have anything to do with work setups that aren't being waited on, that aren't being charged for, then some of this stuff can be helpful for you. This is about setting SMART goals. So you guys have heard me talk about SMART testing, but SMART goals is more of the classic SMART goal setup where you have specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-based goals, and about taking action. Here are some of the actions that you can take, and it helps you to define those goals. So that's in part 1. And I'll go ahead and paste that into the comments right now for those of you who are in here live. You can go ahead and check that out and link it. But that is that first piece for Goals and Practices Embroidery Part 1. And there's a second part to it as well. This is part 2. And this one is talking about exercises that help you to refine your goals and provide actionable steps. So this is about some of the things we've talked about on the show. But if you're someone who's a reader like I am, this might be useful for you. Swatch testing, how to deal with materials, relationships between different parts of the embroidery process, relationships between stitch types and interactions that you can test out, and the discussion of self-directed projects and analysis. So this is stuff that I think is interesting and it's worthwhile just to check out. So if you guys want to check that out, like I said, it's something for you to kind of follow up on later if we're talking about private practicing, just doing your own work and kind of having something that's interesting to you to help you work. Let's go ahead and put that up on screen. That's the link. And we'll go ahead and grab that QR code for you up there. That QR code with the number 2 on it. That is the second portion of that series. So like I said, it is something that I think is worthwhile just to take a look at what you would want to do for your personal practice. We will return to some of these kind of topics as we go on through today, but I thought it was worthwhile to get that out of the way. That way, later on, you come back to this, you can jump in early, grab those links for yourself, and go ahead and check out those articles. So like I said, a couple of articles for Graphics Pro about kind of personal practice and self-directed projects, and I still think that's really important to do. I really cannot stress enough that experience is going to make the difference between good digitizing and great digitizing. Even if you listen to somebody like me, if you take direct education, no matter how you go about this thing, no matter how you get your initial information for digitizing, the way that you're going to be a great digitizer and embroiderer is to have personal practice, self-guided projects, and to honestly get on those machines. I still think that it's really critical to get experiential information, to get that experience in. And this is the way I always talk about this. If you guys know me, I spent a little bit of time in Iceland when I was younger. And when I was out there studying in Iceland, a good friend of mine there told me this phrase that has never left me since. And she talked about how you understand something almost physically, how you really take in something that you learn. And what she said is you have to understand it below your lower jaw. And what it means to me is this: you can't just sit there and think about the thing that you're trying to do. You can't conceptualize it forever. It can't just live in your head while you think and spin and try and figure it all out. Eventually, there has to become a point where you put it into practice and where you understand it almost bodily, physically. And with embroidery, I think that's in the process of embroidering. But with digitizing, it's in the process of creating something, testing it, and refining it. Yes, that means trial and error work. I think trial and error work is something that we're just all going to have to do at some point, but it's something that is worthwhile still. And I would like to kind of just recommend to you guys self-directed projects, things that you make for yourself where there isn't the stress of somebody waiting for that result, can help if you are gripping, if you're having trouble getting yourself started. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and comment and say hi to a couple of people who are here live, and then we'll get into this process. And like I said, I'm going to talk again about how I came into the industry and kind of how I started and how my experience ran. And then, like I said, we'll get into a little bit more where we get information from, what's important about it, and how we can kind of make our way from where we started to proficiency in digitizing, to proficiency in embroidery in a way that I think is useful. Like I said, pros, cons, where we come from, and kind of the pathways that everybody's going on. So let's go ahead and say hi to some folks. My sheet says, hello, hello. Happy to have you in. Jan is here as well. Hi, Jan. Jan says, excited about the show. I'm excited to share with you guys. Like I said, this is a conversational show, maybe a little less technical. I know people like those project shows, and I'll get back to those, but this is something that I think is worthwhile. And having been asked repeatedly how I got to where I am and where I think everybody should be, I think honestly it's a worthwhile discussion to have. And what I like to do is this: I tend to fall into the point of saying, hey, I'd rather be honest and open about my experience. I can't tell you if your experience is going to be the same, nor can I vouch for or own any part of somebody else's experience, but I can tell you where I came from and the things that I've seen along the way. All right, so we have Barb coming in saying good afternoon, everybody. Hi, Barb. Happy to have you in. Barb says the articles have been great to read. I appreciate alerting us to it. All right, thank you. Yeah, there's more coming. Like I said, more articles, more education coming. DAX shows coming up. There's some interesting stuff going on with Printing United, and you can always find more from me there, as well as some of the stuff I do for Embrilliance if you want to get some of the freebie designs, which often have some education in them. And Jan says, I purchased a multi-needle Melka but knew nothing. I didn't know about different machines, etc. I can embroider but not good digitizing. Yeah, you know what? Here's the thing. That's a fine way to start. Being on the machine, like I've said a million times, being on the machine is really going to give you a immediate visceral sense of the interaction between the needles, threads, fabrics, stabilizers, and the operating principles of the machine. And that is going to give you more background for digitizing than anything. I think digitizing often for me, it comes to the point of people becoming almost stuck in their minds about what the input on the software is going to do and what it means, or getting in their own way by staring at the screen and being very concerned about how the screen looks without translating it to the fact that the embroidery is not going to look like the screen. And we are trying to make a transitional item. The file is a transitional item. We don't really have to have the file look great. We only have to have the stitches look great, which means we have to divorce ourselves to some degree from at least some portion of the precision that happens in digitizing, because we have to understand that everything is in service of the embroidery, and we can get in our own way. Really breaking down existing designs and looking at good sample work, working toward that, even if it comes to the point of copying it so that you can then see how it was built and how it was put together, can entirely help. And really can't say enough that you have to divorce yourself from the concept that the file is what you're making and that on screen should look correct. If it looks great on screen, it'll look poor on the machine, because there's a natural level of distortion that's always going to happen. But yeah, it's totally fine to start out on a machine running other people's designs and work from there. That's really the way I did it. And I'm very glad for the people who came before me who made good designs, because honestly, without education, the only thing I really had was design analysis to give me the initial startup, aside from, of course, the documentation with my software, which was minimal, but there, software documentation and analysis of designs was enough to get me from zero to essentially being the primary digitizer for a commercial shop within months. Now, I did ridiculous 20-hour days. I'm going to talk about this again, but having that ability to do that and having the desire plus the access to software and decent designs that were made, truthfully, the ones that I looked at, a lot of them were made by old school punchers who made their designs one stitch at a time. Obviously, having that access is immense. And I think that luckily we're now in an era where you can go online, find competent digitizers who are giving away free files or stock design houses and look at those files and analyze them. Also, we're in an era where you can go look at pictures of embroidery all day long that are high resolution pictures of fine embroidery done by commercial houses, done by fashion shops, stare at them, analyze them, take a look at them, and write down notes, and then try something. When I started, that really wasn't the case. And in fact, I'm going to show you a couple of website examples to let you know I started far back enough that when I went to the internet, there were no high resolution images of embroidery to go to. And actually, what I did is spend a lot of time in the library as well. Spent a lot of time in the library looking at fiber arts and embroidery. It's just one of those things that I think people don't talk about, is that we now have access to a wealth of information that we never had before. And luckily, I think that that means everybody starting now is going to have an entirely easier process, or at least they'll have something to work from. The process that is difficult for people now is wading through the large masses of material and finding out what is good to listen to, what is worthwhile to listen to. And that's actually difficult. Let's go ahead and grab a couple more comments before I talk more about this. Our cook says, started with a single needle brother machine, bought a multi-needle brother. It's been almost 3 years embroidering, trying to learn digitizing the hatch. Yeah, I mean, software, multiple different softwares are great. You guys know, we have full disclosure. I work at Embrilliance, and so I'm often working in Stitch Artist. I worked in Will Come for many years. All good softwares, and honestly, the software is not the primary problem you're going to have. Certainly, getting access to the software is not easy for everybody, because costs being what they are, you want to go with something that you can afford that makes sense. One of the things I love about Stitch Artist is it being modular. You can get into digitizing very inexpensively and still be able to do a commercial level work. But once you get there, it's the knowledge of embroidery that's going to make the difference between just kind of plonking around and following the recipe of somebody showing you what to do and being able to make something and understand the basis behind it. So that's really something that I think is interesting. And like I said, if I had something to recommend the way that I learned, which was really trial and error and trial by fire, if you want to put it that way, it is that in doing that work, I understood the why behind each stitch and behind the way stitches were placed, and what happened on the equipment, what happened when we had an interaction with particular kinds of materials that were either stretchy or had grain or had something else going on with them that caused differences to the final work, that caused differences to the stitch quality. Knowing that and getting the why in meant that whenever I started on a new piece of software, when I first came out of the gate, I was on QDT. I'll talk about that in a moment. QDT Verifier 2C, that was the original software I had that was DOS based, and quite frankly, pretty rough, pretty rough. It wasn't stitch by stitch, but it was pretty rough. It didn't have a lot going for it as far as automation, or even as far as things like automatic underlays that made a lot of sense, or any of the tools that we take for granted. Like I said, drawing curves was not something it did. You had to draw in a different way just to make these things work. However, understanding that why meant that when I moved from QDT, and the first time I came out, I did Melco. So I worked with their software at first, and then I went to Willcom. And when I moved later on down the road to other softwares and tried different softwares, worked in Pulse for a while, and now working in Stitch Artist, it was about translating the things I already knew I needed to do into a different metaphor for how to draw shapes. And that meant no matter where I stopped, no matter what software I touched, I knew what I needed before the software could show me what I needed. And that software knowledge wasn't the critical thing that I needed. Now, you have to have tools that do good work. There are certain things that are interesting, that are automated, that don't take away from your creativity, that absolutely are software based. The faux marrow stitch that's in Stitch Artist 3 and Merrily, that's one of those things where we have auto cornering faux marrowing that, yes, you can make something happen, but it's something that really is based in the tool. Whereas we're talking about the big four, right? The big four types of stitches that I always teach people about: straight stitch and manual stitch, and satin and fill. Those are fairly universal. The way we draw shapes might be slightly different, but knowing what kind of shapes to draw, how to overlap them, the stitch angles that I need, the stitch lengths that I need, and why underlay should be in a certain place, stitches should be in a certain sequence, knowing all of that stuff means that those big four that are fairly universal in every software, they are very similar as far as their execution. I can make whatever I need to make in just about any software. And it isn't the software that's usually holding folks back. It's the why. It's the why. And that's also why you might find I talk about project level classes. I don't mind project level education. If you want to learn how to make a thing from start to finish, that is awesome. It does get you what I consider a quick win, which is something that we often need, is to get from nowhere to a project very quickly. But just following along with the recipe and getting a project out at the other end might not tell you the why. And that's why folks like me who do the why and maybe the longer lecture style classes exist. Not because the project classes aren't good, but because to supplement those project classes, understanding the why lets you make whatever you want to make and understand why you're taking under the steps that you are. So, like I said, there's different ways to go about it. Got a couple more comments and we'll go in. Brian Bailey, Creative and Brilliance, is here. Hello, everyone. No school run today, so I can hang with Eric and you all. Thank you for being here, Brian. Brian, who has learned and knows quite a bit about embroidery and educating on embroidery. We have Joanne saying hi to everybody. And Barb says, started on a single needle embroidery machine with about 20 years ago. Had a great teacher as I'm a hands-on learner. 2018, bought my first multi-needle tool head. Had a trainer on site for 2 days. Yeah, good to have a trainer. Good to have experience. So with that, folks, let's get into it. I'm going to talk about how I came into the industry a little bit, just quickly. I'll give you the synopsis and the story just so I can be clear about where I came from, right? So the first thing I'm going to tell you guys, and this is maybe something that people don't always like to hear, they like to think of these mythical stories where the people who are in particular positions or people who are educators consistently dreamed about doing the thing that they're doing. And I'm going to go ahead and disabuse you of that notion. I was not somebody who did embroidery when I was a kid or dreamed about doing embroidery my whole life. It's not the first thing I ever tried to do. And honestly, I was not somebody who was particularly an artist when I was a little kid. I really was somebody who wrote quite a bit. I wrote and read and was into education and certainly did some technical stuff and certainly did some building of things, built a lot of Legos and was super into tech and computers when I was younger. And that was my thing. I was just a high level computer user, not somebody else who does the, I didn't do the programming like I probably should have done back in the day, but I really did want to use the tools. And if there was something I did younger as a kid that might have been interesting to this whole process, I would say very, very early on, I did pixel art. So early pixel art. And I remember being very excited the first time I had a piece of software where I could draw pixel art, pixel by pixel, and I had 256 colors. And that was amazing. I mean, that was the day I could make 16-bit style art. Boy, that was crazy. But that might be the only thing that really leads into it. Now, I will say this. I have to thank my mother for the experience I had just being around fabric and thread, because she worked as, at the time, she called as a seamstress. I think a lot of people say a sewist these days. Either way is fine by me. Depends on how you like to be called. But she worked in sewing. So I wasn't like unaware of what a machine was, but I'm going to be clear and tell you guys that I can't sew all that well. I am nowhere near a good construction sewist. And honestly, I am not somebody who really does that. I like to make embroideries, but if someone else wants to make the shirt, I will make that shirt pretty. I am happy all day long to make the designs, but not as much a sewist. So when I started to do this thing, this really came out of just serendipity. So I ended up working at a shop, at a screen print and embroidery shop. And this was, toward the end of high school to the beginning of college. I worked at the shop, hucking boxes in and out of a box truck. Like, that's really the primary thing that I originally did, right? I was an embroidery guy only after that. First thing was me in the back of a box truck, hucking down big boxes of screen printed shirts. However, what I always have been is very willing to take something on if a task needed to be done. And to this day, that's something that I've always done. Hence why when you hear me talk about e-commerce and things like that, how did that happen? We needed e-commerce. We needed somebody to build websites at my company. And so I just worked on it. And I was somebody, once again, into computers and tech. So I built my own websites when I was a kid, just because I wanted to share stuff early on. So here's the thing. Frankly, I started out just being around, but they needed somebody to work in embroidery. And I said, yes, I wanted to try it. So I started out learning on really quite old equipment. The first ones are actually Melco Starlet machines. You guys may or may not know what those are, but trust me, it's been quite a long time since those older Melco machines were there. It's not like the Melco machine that you're probably imagining right now. And the machines that I worked on after that were a couple of rather old 12-head Tajima machines. I worked on those primarily, and they were 12-head, 6-needle machines. And to that point, I'm going to see if I can show you a couple of pictures of the kinds of machines that I was on, just the head unit, nothing else on it. So I'm just going to show you the head. Suffice it to say, though, This is what I'm talking about. 6 needles. So 6 needles, flat table, spectacle frames. You're looking at it. I was hooping everything in these spectacle frames. So this, as you can see in here, this kind of hoop window, the spider web, we always called it. These frames went inside of them. They don't have arms. They do have lugs so that you can kind of orient them vertically, but there's no tubular arms. You have to pull your stuff around the outside. It's very much like, honestly, like more of a flatbed home embroidery machine has to be dealt with. When we did completed shirts, we had to kind of roll them around the outside of the hoop, very much like you would do for a home embroidery machine. And we put them in these spectacle frames and it rode flat on the table. But that's what I worked on. This is a 6 needle Tajima machine. I think it's an SC. I'm trying to remember, but suffice it to say, this is primarily the vision that I had starting out, doing all of the pieces on these spectacle frames, on these old school frames that look very much like a standard embroidery frame. If you look at this frame, there's no arms on it. It's just a double ring, just like you would imagine for hand embroidery. This one's plastic. Some of them were wood back in the day, but this is where I started from, right? So that's how that looked. And I spent a lot of time right back here. You see that old school Tajima green painted on the back of that thing. This is the thread rack behind it. You can see through it some modern Tajima machines, or at least some much more modern Tajima machines within the last decade or so. But these machines back here, this was what I was working on. So you can see kind of the spectacle frames. You can see how the spectacles are held down. The frames are screwed into the big sash. And this is also, if you guys have ever seen a sash frame running on a table where you're doing a really large span, like curtains or something like that, they often had that same thing hooked to this sash. You could go ahead and hook in a sash frame as well, but these had the individual frames, so it's very much like that flat hoop that you just saw there. So that was really my introduction. So that's the first machines I ran were those. And the thing I'm going to tell you was they weren't always in great repair, and they didn't have thread break sensors. So the thing to remember about that is I was a watcher. I ran up and down the machine, watching and making sure that nothing broke. If the thread broke, I had to run, stop the machine, back it up, rethread the head that was messed up, and keep running on it. And you can imagine, of course, that's not much different than anything else, but imagine that I had to catch any of the frays or breaks by watching the design run. Right. So I had to be watching the design run and making absolutely sure that I could watch it. Why is that important? Because as I become a digitizer, which I'll talk about in a second, it means that these are the kind of machines I was running on first, and you had to be very careful because once you had a thread break, it was a big deal. It was actually an issue. And frankly, that I think was kind of part of how I really became good at this, because I watched the machines run like a hawk. I was fixed on this hoop. I was watching every single stitch. And so I saw things like the way that the stitches were deforming the material, the way that tension was gathering toward the center of each stitch. If we had a satin column, I could see how it was narrowing in real time. If I didn't hoop tight enough, or if I hooped in a way that wasn't working, if it was sliding, or if the material was slippery, I could see the material moving in the hoop and bunching and rippling. I could see that if the sequence I was running in my design, especially on material that was really stretchy, if I ran a sequence where I sewed something and then pathed toward it, the apparent motion of the needle went toward the thing that I'd already stitched down, that it was causing ripples and puckers. These are things that I was watching happen live. And once I started watching my own designs run on these kinds of machines, I was seeing the reaction to the things I changed in the software. What I changed in the software, I then ran on the machine, and watching it on these kinds of machines, number one, had to watch it like a hawk to make it work. Number two, as I was watching it, I could see the difference between different materials running. I could see the difference between different stitch types. I could see the difference between different densities and lengths live in the hoop as they ran. I would digitize something, run it, refine it, run it again. And the other machine I spent a bunch of time on, and this is just to kind of show you my little baby machine that I loved very much, and you guys have heard me talk about it and joked around about it before. This is a commercial Brother machine. So before Brother got out of commercial machines, they had a range of metal machines that looked very much like you might expect from a Tajima or any other kind of machine there. This is a BAS 415. I loved this machine. I ran it into the ground. It was a fantastic little machine. So a tubular single head, so much more traditionally like you would expect. There's some allied hoops on it. So this is one of the better hoops because it's got you see these little green hash marks. It's got the alignment marks, and boy, did I ever love having alignment marks and angle marks on the hoop itself. But if we look at this piece, right, So very, very simple 9 needle machine. So a lot of my stuff really was 9 colors. It was quite a few years before we went from the 9 color machines because we even went to a set of 9 color Tajimas. It was many years before I was on a 15 color machine. And you'll also recognize that in a lot of my designs, I have a tendency to reduce colors down and to use blending of multiple colors to create to create multiple colorways or to create shading. It's something else I had to learn starting on these previous machines. So starting with 6 threads, you better believe that I had to understand the use of color very carefully. But it also meant that in that restriction, yes, I learned that, but then I had to relearn once we had the ability to use 15 colors, I had to relearn color. And you'll find that I probably have a more simplified version of color that I do because I went for many years on 6 and 9 needle machines, spent most of my time on 9 needles. And this particular brother machine is the one that I ran right into the ground. So, like I said, BAS 415, you may have seen other machines like that. It ran caps and flats. It spent a lot of its time on flats, but this is a standard, like Tajima styled machine is what people used to call it. But it is a tubular machine. So you can run with the cylinder inside of the garment, and it's a lot easier than running the flats. It's back in the day, it was all about those flats. It was all about spectacle frames running on the table. What I am going to tell you, though, is running on a table, especially if you're talking about something that is big and heavy, you're talking about doing jacket backs, having this frame riding on the table really provides an incredible amount of stability. And to this day, if I had something that is really large, I've got a big open jacket that's running flat like this, running on table, even with the tubulars that allow you to run on the table and allow the hoop to ride on it if they have the right hoop for it. I still feel like that provides a tremendous amount of stability. And I'll say this: we used to do really large spans, really large jacket backs, and even on one of my later shops, we would run a really quite old Barrett machine. And the Barrett machine that we had usually wasn't good for more than a couple of colors because it didn't do automatic color change correctly anymore. But that machine, we ran really big pieces on those sash style frames on the table. And those table machines really are incredibly stable. So, like a lot of other things, we can talk about the improvements that we've had since then. But there is just something to say that these machines have a tendency to bounce a lot more. There's a lot more flagging, and there's some distortion from this bouncing without having the table, especially with super heavy materials or super heavy jackets. Running on bags is something like that too. Not that you can do those on table, but running heavy jackets on these is not as easy as running them on the table. So if you have the ability to use tables for that, I still like it. But the funny thing to kind of know about that too is that if you're looking at this sash and you're looking at the frame that's running on here, it actually had some glides. There was kind of like embedded felt glides inside of this metal frame here that let it glide on the table and not have quite so much friction. So like I said, the flatbed machines are still useful. And the funny thing is that to this day, I would still use table for certain stuff because it makes sense. And especially if you're doing anything sash frame, of course, you're using that on the table. So the other people I know who know this very well, patch makers, lots of patch makers run massive spans of patch material where they're running tons of patches, and they run them in a sash frame where they're essentially clipping all the edges of a large span of material, and they run flat on the table regularly. So those folks I don't have to speak to, but everybody who comes from a really tubular first kind of setup may or may not have that. But yeah, like I said, so those are the kind of machines that I started out running. I ran on 6 needle Tajimas. I ran 2 of those myself as an operator. I have to certainly praise the operator who taught me originally. Elena, who was there, taught me a lot of what I know. And she really started me out in the process. I think I then learned a lot on my own. But the thing to say is, the way this all started for me was I said yes to helping out in the embroidery department. I worked on a machine for a while, and then as I'm working on the machines, I'm running those 12 heads, and I know we have that single head that I really didn't get to touch, but I wanted to because that was the new machine. The Brother at the time for us, that was the new cool machine, the Brother 9 needle, and I wanted to play with that thing for sure when we got it in. But the thing was, uh, as we're working on those machines, I recognized that there was a computer up in the corner. And to be honest with you, this computer that was in the corner of our embroidery department looked a little old, but I was pretty young. And I thought, you know what? I would really enjoy looking that over and seeing what that tool was. I'm like, what is this thing that's under a dust cover in the corner? And there was a part of me that really thought, awesome. I hope we have the internet here. I'm going to dial in and I'm going to look stuff up and I'm going to enjoy playing on the internet, because you got to remember how early this was. 99, we're talking about something very early. Internet is new and interesting and fun. And I was like, man, is that connected to the network here? We actually have DSL here in our company. We have decent internet. I would love to get on that. Also, I thought, wait, is that an embroidery thing? Does that have something to do with the machines? Is there something I could be doing here? Can I make something? And yes, when I asked about it, turns out they're like, "Hey, oh yeah, that's the one that has software. It makes the designs for the machine, but nobody knows how to use that. Nobody wants to do that." I thought, "Wow, I can control these machines. We've got these big machines like the picture of the ZSK sitting behind me. We've got these big machines that I can control. I'm like, I've now been watching this. I wondered how it was made. I want to make my own stuff. And it's not just text that I can type in. It's not just having to order it from somewhere. And back in the day, we were talking about ordering stock designs on CDs or manually, even having them mailed in. We had designs that were mailed in from digitizers on discs. And I was aware of, though I never used myself, paper tapes. Those still existed though. And some of the designs I had were converted from paper tape designs. Yeah, it was incredibly slow, but I knew that that was what was going on. And I'm like, wow, we can control it ourselves. I have got to get on that. I want to do that. I want to be able to control this big iron. And for me, embroidery was just a way. I'm like, wow, all this time I've been making this pixel art and making things online and, trying to make these digital pieces of art and drawing and, doing all this stuff, but mostly pixel based, mostly raster based. This is not, drafting yet. This is not vector yet. That comes later in at least my history. But I now know that, oh, wow, I can actually use software on a computer and then control what to me is like, it's an XY axis robot of some kind. And I'm going to be able to use it to make real physical objects. I was super excited about that. I always tell people this, in another era, I probably would be doing, CNC routing or 3D printing or something else if I was still that kid at that right time, right? But in this case, for me, that was my first access to any way of taking this kind of digital world of stuff that I'd been making on computers, because my parents had been good enough to get me on computers and to have computers in our home at great expense to them and great difficulty for a normal kid. But the ability to do that meant for me, I was super excited to go from the digital into the physical world. And when I heard that that was a possibility, I was just jazzed. I wanted to learn that for sure. So, and the way that I put it now is kind of the funny way of putting it, but at the same time, this access did mean a lot to me. I always say this, the boss that I had at the time was nice enough to let me have all of the off work hours I wanted to play around on that software and to figure it out for myself. And so I, being a trustworthy person who said yes to a lot of things and had done things like work on the company computers, like fix things in the network and stuff like that, he trusted me to have a key and to come in and work on that software. So I spent a lot of long hours, and I remember doing testing late at night and working incredibly long hours in that early period, trying to figure this stuff out. And let me tell you that I beat my head against the wall with some of those designs. Some of the early designs that I did were absolutely terrible. I destroyed stuff. I broke thread. Some of the really earliest ones, I broke needles because I had no concept of how long a stitch should be. And until I got the concept of analyzing a design, I just couldn't quite figure it out. And at first, I had problems because the default settings in the software were not all that particularly useful. And some of the pieces that I had looked at were kind of hard to figure out because I was looking at physical embroidery and originally I wasn't able to analyze the software so well. As I started digitizing all the time, started working on it, I figured out that I could take the original file, look at the original file, make measurements. And it was hard to do originally because it wasn't something that it was really made for. I could make measurements that I could then transplant those settings into what I was currently working on. And I still, to this day, I will say this, when I first started, the way that I finally figured out stitch length is I found this jacket back design that we had done, this beautiful piece that was done stitch by stitch of a World War II era fighter plane. And I remember looking at the fill on that thing and going, man, I'm just so frustrated. Why doesn't my fill look like this? And it finally clicked to me that I was like, all right, wait a minute. I have this design. I've got the old tape conversion for it. I brought it into my software and I stopped. And even though the scale wasn't all that easy to figure out, I started making measurements. I looked at how it was put together. And then between looking at the physical piece and looking at the screen and figuring out where I had to measure what it was that it was trying to define to me, where stitch length was coming from, I figured out the stitch length, the density, and the pattern, and I copied it. I copied those settings for my first really successful fill, and I set myself up my own settings from that point. And that's when I started to do what I talk about all the time, which is swatch testing. Swatch testing being making little squares, and in these little squares, putting all my settings together for my fills, my settings, my setup. Maybe sometimes I would do things like stitch combinations. Here's a square of fill that has a satin stitch on the edge. Here's a square of fill with straight stitch around it. Here's a satin stitch with straight stitches around it. And I would just put together these little palettes, these little swatches, and change settings, individual settings on it, and write all that down next to the swatch and make squares and squares and squares, little grids of squares to show me what would happen when I touched the dials, what would happen when I changed the settings. And that's what happened. I went from running the designs and understanding how they worked, starting to see how they're put together, watching the sequence of how they ran, how things were layered, looking at what was overlapped and why, what underlay was and what it was doing, and realizing, by the way, that the automated version of what people were calling underlay, when I finally did figure that out, didn't always make sense to me, because a lot of the pieces I was looking at early on were manually, one by one, stitch by stitch, punched pieces, where the underlay styles that we know now and take for granted today may not always have been the norm. Because what it really was, it wasn't underlay as a setting that they were creating. It was, I need some support here. I'm going to draw some stitches in a structural way that provides support under this kind of stitch, under this kind of junction, under this place where the border meets a fill. So I was looking at that, and then looking at modern software when I finally got into modern software that had more automation. And it took me a minute to figure that out, that some of the types that we call underlay types or stitch types weren't the same as the stuff I was looking at, because people were setting stitches one at a time. And I became someone who kind of blended manual techniques with automated techniques. And when I say automated, I don't mean auto digitizing. I mean things like literally a fill that is set for a certain sort of density and setting, or automated as in I drew a shape and it immediately filled with satin stitches instead of me dropping every stitch. I mixed manual type execution, drawing my own underlays, drawing my own blocks of stitching and details, with having automated fills, eventually complex fills with holes. My first software did not have that. Couldn't make a fill with a hole in it. Eventually using more of the automated tools to make my job faster, but I already knew what I wanted before I had the automated tool telling me. So this is why I think my kind of concept went a little differently. I started out fully commercially. The hard part about that was that I was working on big equipment. I did not originally sample on a single head machine, so it was kind of a pain in the butt to sample on the big machines. Only later did we have that capability. And if I messed something up, usually if I was starting to drag down the schedule, sometimes I was taking on jobs that really were in the pipe that were supposed to be paid for, and it was difficult, and there was some stress there. And I remember distinctly, there was a design for a local casino that had a really detailed piece in it in a very small area, and I must have made 12 versions of it to get it right. And by the time I hit that 12th version, you better believe that the file name was something that I couldn't repeat in polite company. And frankly, I was tired of looking at it. And believe me, people were definitely waiting for it on the other end in production. So, like I said, there is some con to that, to starting out in a fully commercial place and not doing self-directed projects. Whereas somebody who comes from the embroidery enthusiast side of the world, you might have been able to work as a hobby on your own work, on your own self-directed projects. And probably by the time you decide, if you ever decide to go commercial or to scale up, you already have a lot of basic ground in, built in skill for stitch types and setups and conversion and interpretation, because you've worked on that. And in fact, you're very likely, if you're a crafter, here's one of the pros of being a crafter, you're very likely to have worked with a wider range of materials and to have done some creative and textural work. Whereas somebody like I was in the original kind of commercial period that I worked in, everything was, fill stitch, satin stitch, straight stitch, or running stitch. That's it. And we didn't work with texture that much. Most of our areas were filled. And a lot of the work we did early on, and eventually why I started doing work like silhouette work and carving and other stuff that had texture to it, was because all the work I saw looked like a coloring book. It was big flood fills of stitches with big, thick boundaries made in satin, and everything looked like that. And all the stock designs looked like that, unless they were naturalistic pieces, stuff like outdoor stuff. Other than that, if it wasn't animals and stuff like that, it really was a lot of that coloring book work. A lot of our logos were very simple. And coming out of that, it did take some time. It did take some time to then learn texture and other materials and applique and applying, even when we started to use more stabilizers. The other thing I'm going to really make clear to you is when I first started, we had two stabilizers that you would run: medium cutaway, medium tearaway. That was what we did. Maybe you might stack more than one if it was something cantankerous, which I later did not do since I don't like big, thick slabs of stabilizer. But that was it. We had white, medium cutaway, white, medium tearaway. That was about it. So you can also imagine that when I first started, we only used 40 weight thread. So 40 weight thread, rayon when I first started, moved on to poly because of the need for industrial laundry and bleaching. But rayon, 40 weight thread, two kinds of stabilizer. That does, however, minimize all of the choices you might make there. You don't have to learn all the different materials. It means, though, that all the small text, all the tiny detail, and dealing with any kinds of difficult materials that had stretch or other kinds of issues like that, no specialty materials were going to be used on those. We were going to have to make it work with the materials that we had. And that meant that you did have to work against it, and that some things were going to be out of your reach, especially super fine detail, super tiny text. That's kind of stuff where you were doing a lot of manual work to make the 40 weight thread work as best it could. Now, it might not be the same for everybody else's shop, but really also one needle size, 7511 was almost everything I ran for most of my career. We didn't run finer needles. We ran occasionally thicker needles, and only for super heavy structured caps that wouldn't hold up correctly when we ran that stuff right through, like I said, right through the massive kind of rolled seams on structured hats. That was where we would use the 9010s, or we would have reinforced needles. And that is only later in my career. Originally, 7511 needles, 40 weight thread all day, every day, and a couple kinds of stabilizer, and that was it. But it also meant that a lot of our work, I would say, was very samey. The texture, the hand of the work was not always very good, and often was a bit too thick, a bit too bulletproof. I was somebody who was always fighting for less stitching. And in fact, I think if you looked back at some of the handmade pieces, some of the work that was punched by hand, it was lighter than that initial generation of work that was done on the screen by people who were using automated, or at least complete digitizing as we know it today instead of punching. I think a lot of that work was heavier. A lot of the stock designs were heavier in densities, whereas now we're starting to back it up again. And the stuff that I learned from that was punched one stitch at a time was often a little bit lighter than the stuff that I ended up seeing for quite some time. There was just this era of super bulletproof, super heavy embroidery that you couldn't jab a scissor through if you wanted to. So like I said, it makes a difference. It makes a difference to what you kind of learn and what you do. But in any case, we have a couple of comments, and I'll go from here into some pros and cons and some learning styles and stuff like that. But that's how I came to it. Worked on commercial machines, was an operator, worked on multi-head equipment, was mentored in by an operator, but then took to learning digitizing on my own. Really, it was analysis. It was running things. It was looking through the manual and figuring it out. After that, sometime later, I found kind of my first introduction to other digitizers was reading magazines. So we had the like EMB and eventually Stitches magazine, and I read some of those. And only much later, after I had already learned to digitize and I was working commercially as a digitizer, did I go to a class and sign up for a group that had classes. But to be honest with you, by the time that I signed up for the group that had classes, and the first and only class I ever went to for digitizing, when I went in there, I presented this piece. We were looking at things and talking about design analysis, and I had somebody's design that I had torn apart, and I made a little dossier, which is something I used to do. Believe me, I'm as nerdy as you might expect when it comes to embroidery. I had looked at someone's design and broken it down piece by piece. This is how the fills go. This is how the texture is. These are the stitch angles. These are the penetration point patterns for the fill. This is the density on each of them. This is how many layers are in any given area. These are the colors in the right order. And I wrote out a dossier on this design that I wanted to be able to reproduce. And when I showed this to the educator who was teaching, he picked it up and he said, "This is great." And he ran up to the front office of the place where I was learning, made a bunch of copies of it, showed it to everybody, and handed it out to the people who were in the class. This doesn't mean I didn't have anything to learn from the people who were there. I mean, there was definitely something to learn. But by the time that I managed to get out into the world where people were doing education, I was kind of already cooked. I had already done the work, and I was able to, at the very least, put together meaningfully decent work that was efficient enough and looked good enough to be commercially used, and was kind of the genesis of the work that I did throughout my career and that I do to this day. So frankly, I came from this world of beating your head into a design until it worked, analyzing other people's work and figuring out how to put together, and just clicking the buttons, playing with the software until I made it do the thing that I could tell from looking at the design that I needed, from looking at other people's designs, and from sitting and just noodling and imagining to myself what it was that I was trying to achieve. I went from that direct into digitizing. The thing is, I don't know that's always the way everybody should do, right? I don't think that's the way everybody can do necessarily or should do. And in fact, one of the reasons I got into education, why I'm going to be out at the DAX show next week, why I'm writing for all these articles and magazines, why I wrote for that original blog, which makes me a little sick to my stomach to think about it. My first blogging was almost 17 years ago on this topic. Why did I teach all this time? To stop everybody from having to go through the initial phase of beating your head in, running into the wall, and continually breaking thread, breaking needles, and not knowing what it was that was causing bad textures in your garment, or not understanding how to interpret things. When I kind of champion direct education, it is a way to avoid those initial pitfalls and to speed you up so that you can stand on the shoulders of giants. And I don't mean to be saying, I am the giant, aside from the fact that I am quite literally a massive human being. You can stand on the shoulders of giants in that you can stand on top of all that work and trial and error that we did and take off from that point. I was already standing on the shoulders of the people who had learned how to punch, on that 6:1 expanded thing on the wall where they had a full cartooned out piece of art, and they were dropping every single stitch that had been measured out with a density wheel and all of that stuff. They were working on these drafted pieces. Those people already knew, and they were taking concepts that were worked on a hand loom at some point. Like, the world of embroidery had already been there all that time back. I was standing on their shoulders, analyzing their designs. And then coming from that, I wanted to produce something where they could have that of me, the work that I did, the trial and error could be something I could pass to someone else and say, here's where I bashed my head into the wall. Here's where I continually did trial and error. Learn this why, learn the elements, learn the basic constructions. And from there, from those stitch interactions, from the understanding of stitch types, from the understanding of density and stitches, you will be able to make whatever you want without, bashing your head in, without constantly doing what I did, which is the cycle. Even though I teach you guys smart testing is what I always call it, to test and to repeat, to stitch, measure, analyze, rework and retest, rework and test. That's smart. The smart testing cycle. That cycle is something that I want you to do as few times as you have to. And if we can preload you with the information of the why, you don't have to do all that stuff. But like I said, we got a couple things to share here. I'm going to talk about some people's comments, and then we'll go ahead and go on to my pros, cons, and kind of commentary on that stuff. So fun stuff here. At least we have a little bit here from before. Yeah. Joanne says, oh, you had to babysit the machine, time consuming. Absolutely. But I think it was really valuable and absolutely something necessary to me, at least necessary to my process. Barb says, started digitizing about 18 months ago, much to learn, but love it. Yeah, it's something that I can't recommend enough to people. If it's something you think you're going to like and you try it, and you may do it forever. Lots of commercial people don't do it. They hire it all out. I still think the understanding of why we put stitches where we put them and what they do technically can help you communicate with a digitizer, even if you're never going to do it yourself. For those of us who love it, it's something that's fully worthwhile. And yeah, and Joanne, absolutely, a lot of embroidery enthusiasts who can't sew a stitch. I can sew a little bit, but boy, it's about hemming. That's about all I can do. I can probably do a little bit more, but mostly that's what I can achieve because I don't keep in practice with it. Barb says, sewing about 54 years, boat tops to wedding wear, along with couture sewing for garments and pattern drafting. Hey, congratulations. You've got it on me for sure. Love it. I love to see people who are doing that too, because I've always been mystified by the ability to make that 3D object out of stitching where you can understand how the seams go. I'm just going to be honest and say that I never did it myself very much. I can make something happen, but I'm a heck of a lot better on the machine and controlling the friendly embroidery robots than I am sewing. Joanne says, fun to see your machine history. Yeah, like I said, those are my early machines. I've run a lot of stuff since then to the highest technology of machines we have now. At the same time, I still have a great deal of respect for and love for those old school manual machines. Joanne says, remember the first introduction of the Brother Tubular machines in the home market? We were mesmerized because you've only seen flatbed single needle combos. Yeah, absolutely. Tubular machines are incredibly useful and allow you access that you just don't get other ways. It's very much easier to use a tubular machine for a lot of work. And frankly, it's something that I don't know how I do without now, but I think it's worthwhile to understand where the tables still have function. That's why I kind of share those things. A lot of people come into this now, especially in the commercial world, coming straight from a tubular only setup and have never really seen or worked on tables where tables could really help them out sometimes. So, like I said, we always learn. And Barb, you totally correct. Modem data used to take forever to download a file to surf the web. Yeah, I remember leaving a modem running on dial-up to get an image. I certainly remember that time. And BBSs, bulletin board systems, if you're not quite as old as I am. I was young when I was on them, probably too young to be on them. But I do definitely remember tying up the phone line and having people fairly unhappy with that. All right, Marlise says, I too do a lot of stitching of small test squares and stitch settings and make notes on the state of our fabric neck straight. Absolutely. That is the way to do it. Swatch testing. Swatch testing is still useful now. If you have new materials, new techniques, if you're working with new threads and you want to figure out how things work, or even if you just have a setting that you're not quite sure of, making small tweaks to the setting and several small swatches and explaining those tweaks for later, it helps you to develop a palette of settings you can refer to when you make new designs. And I think that is just fantastic. So yeah, John says I paid my dues. Yeah, for sure I did. But you know what? That's what we all have to do. I think we all pay our dues, and even the folks who are in there now who are coming at this with lots of education, with YouTube channels that are devoted to them. Hey, with me talking in your ear. The truth of the matter is, all of these things, as valuable as they are, everyone still pays their dues. Everyone does trial and error, and I respect people having it. And frankly, here's the other thing: anytime I ever hear somebody go, "Man, you guys just don't get it. You kids have it so easy these days." Isn't that the whole point of what we're doing here, guys? I'm trying to make this easier for the next generation so that they can get to the creative work. If they don't have to freak out on trying to make a fill stitch look good, they can go on to create the next version, the next effect, the next creative thing. They can make a piece of art instead of making more test swatches like I always have to do. I still recommend them when you're trying to understand things. There is value there. But if they can get up and running faster, they can get to the wonderful images in their mind quicker than I did and not have to just copy the old stuff that we always did before, right? Come on, folks. That's how it is. And Barb says, great that you share experiences. I'm glad that I have a chance to. And I'm glad that there are people out there who want to listen. And yeah, and Joanne, absolutely, this is true. Having people who did so on my crews over the years has always been incredibly valuable for this reason. The folks who can sew can rip out the seams to get the piece flat, embroider, and then resew. Not that you want to do that, but you could when you knew how. And let me tell you, there's nothing that makes you look like a total champ when you're doing embroidery on jackets, especially high-end jackets, than being able to undo the seam back before the days of what I always affectionately remember as the port pocket, because the Port Authority people from San Mar made these zippered pockets that allow the backs to be opened up so you can sew inside. Back in the day, we used to undo the seams on some jackets on high-end stuff, sew the shell, and then redo the seams of the lining so that the embroidery wasn't through the lining. Boy, does that make you look like a champ all day long, because that is a much cleaner way of handling things. As we have been working on finished goods all the time, it's very common to see people embroider a jacket back through the entirety of a lining. But if you have the ability to sew and the ability to reseam something, upsell that to your customer and show them that finished version. And boy, that is just a much nicer finish. So I would love to be that person. I'm just here to admit, like I say, I like to be really candid with you guys and tell you about my experience. I don't sew so well. I can hem some jeans and make some curtains on a good day, but that's about all I have, even though I've got a sewing machine sitting next to me over here, starting to feel the side eye from my sewing machine over here. But suffice it to say, I'm not a construction stitcher. I'm an embroiderer all day long. That's what I do. I'm a digitizer primarily, even more than an embroiderer, because I prefer to be on the software making stuff. Once I get my first sample done and it looks great, I want to hand it off to the embroiderers even. I like to develop the design. That's my key thing. That's where my joy is. And in teaching you folks and the people who need to hear some of this stuff, I love to be there to teach folks and answer questions. But I have to say it all day long, I am not a construction sewing person for sure. I would rather hand that off to somebody who has a great love and ability for it when they can. But I will say having that in a shop has been very valuable. So for kind of the last little section of the show today, I talked about my experiences. Admittedly, that's kind of where I came from. The first thing to kind of solidify about that is to say my experience really was an embroidery to digitizing chain. I started in execution first. I started on machines. And for me to remember that this is just, I think there is some differences to it. I very much started from a commercial process first. I was a dyed in the wool commercial embroiderer first. My very first stitches on an embroidery machine were done on a larger multi-head machine. So for me, this doesn't mean that there's some things baked in that are different. Number one, I have a tendency to think about the embroidery process first. Because it's commercial, I have a tendency to stay efficient. I don't jump or trim unless I have to. I tend to use fewer colors than other people do for designs. I remember the very first time I ever had to use a home-based stock design, and I was appalled at the number of color changes that were in it. I will not name names on the design package that it came from or tell anybody what it was. However, the first time somebody said to me, "Hey, here's this piece. We really want you to incorporate this into our work." And when they ordered it for us, and it had just tens of color changes to the point where on the really old machines that we had, you couldn't actually store that number of color changes. You'd have to stop and reset the colors at some point. I was horrified because being someone who came from a commercial process, and certainly admittedly having the machines that I started with, having those 6 needle machines and 9 needle machines be most of what I worked on, the concept of allowing for that many colors, number one, because it was meant for a single needle machine. So it even had more colors than the average modern multi-needle machines do now. I had the first piece I worked on, I believe it had more than 15 colors on it. And so there was literally no way for us to thread up a commercial machine to do it exactly as it was shown. So I actually reworked the design to have fewer colors. But coming from that commercial process means I have a tendency to stress efficiency, not to trim and jump any more than I have to. And I have a tendency in my own work when I do interpretations to probably reduce my level of color. I will say, however, that does mean I tend to have a piece that runs a little more efficiently most of the time. And I have a tendency not to jump or trim or have inefficient movements in my pathing. But that's a commercial process first. I came into this trying to get as many units through a machine without stopping that machine as I could. That does have a slightly different take to it than if we're going with a craft process. Craft process isn't bad. And in fact, what the craft process that I'm talking about will present for you is folks who are willing to change threads more often, who are willing to use more processes, who are willing to use more materials than a commercial shop might, can produce kind of incredible masterworks. And in fact, people who come from the craft process who go into highly individualized boutique pieces, boutique work, like I talked about last week when we talked about different kind of places you could land as far as markets for embroidery, that highly personalized, very creative work, I find that people who come from the craft and enthusiast world have a tendency to go there more easily and end up making more upmarket stuff. Whereas commercial process people like me have a tendency to reduce the amount of detail, to reduce the amount of colors, to keep things on a more efficient tack, but it might also be slightly less creative. And in fact, the funny thing is I made a lot of kind of my name in the commercial world by being in the middle of that, by doing more lead work in digitizing, that the file was still efficient, but I had done more carving and textural work and was more willing to kind of explore what could be done with mark making in thread than some of my compatriots locally. It doesn't mean they didn't do good work. It's just that I had a tendency to do a little bit more creative work or go a little further afield from the traditional kind of, like I said earlier, the coloring book style of digitizing. So that's kind of the thing to think about. I certainly had an embroidery to digitizing track. So I embroidered first. I still think that's incredibly valuable to understand something, as we said, below your lower jaw, to really understand it before you work on it. Just in your mind and thinking about it and taking classes is great. But there is something about getting to the embroidery process and understanding threads and fabrics and stabilizers and how those interact that's going to make your digitizing a little bit more grounded. But I think that coming from that straight commercial process makes me a little more efficiency minded. And it doesn't mean that you couldn't be efficiency minded coming from craft, because especially when you're on a single needle machine, it means a lot more work to do the individual changes. But when your unit of reproduction is one piece and the primary goal is the aesthetic value, I think that's a different process than when your goal is many, many pieces and your primary goal is, though you have to have the aesthetics and the balance, the primary goal is smooth running over time. And I think that makes a very different kind of way that you might approach things, even though a lot of us will arrive at the same place. People who work craft will want to reduce the amount of labor they have into something or reduce the amount of inefficiency, or maybe even lighten things up to have a nicer hand on the garment, like I talk about, so it's nice and flowy. And so they will reduce densities, reduce excess the same way that somebody commercial will. Somebody commercial, though, I think it's baked in because we're literally trying to pull down stitch counts and we're trying to keep our machine time a little lower. So I think that's something that can kind of bleed into your process, or at least it did with me. So that's what I think about the craft versus commercial. But the other difference is there are now lots of folks who are engaged in design. There are more and more people who are aware of design and graphic design as a discipline, and as just like early on in kind of the computer revolution, the concept of desktop publishing, when the concept of having someone do all your layout for text kind of went to something that you would do at home quite regularly or on your own software. Same kind of thing here. As design software and the concepts of design and art and creation of content have become more and more democratized, we have a lot of people who are coming from the design side, where it's that they have a concept for an image that they like, for a type of images, a type of styles that they want to evoke on a garment or on some accessories. And they come from a design size where they've been drawing. They draw in software. Maybe they do vector art. Maybe they do raster art, and they do tablet or painting. A lot of people are working in Procreate these days, which is it's an iPad tablet software that is primarily something you're going to be doing more of a raster style painting style work in. And they come with their concepts and designs, their art, and they want to have that digitized. They want to digitize themselves, and they have a different tack. I came from embroidery to digitizing. I knew what embroidery was. I had worked on embroidery machines first. That was the medium always that I was interested in. And then I started to find design in the work of digitizing. I started to learn more about design and graphic design. And I started to do more transitions and working into the print world from embroidery first. I started it with embroidery and came into design as well as digitizing, where now there's people who are coming from design, coming from graphic arts, coming from, honestly, from doing their own artistic work into digitizing. And I think they have a different experience of things too. Those folks have a tendency to prioritize the aesthetics of the piece. The great thing about these folks is once they do learn embroidery, because they have design skills, they can design for the medium once they learn what they need for embroidery, and they become very good at this. Also, they have a familiarity with tools that makes them pick up digitizing software a little easier, though they have to get the experience of the material itself, get the experience of the medium to really make their way. They have a tendency to draw clean art that looks a little too clean in the software and doesn't have the overlaps and boundaries and the slop necessary to compensate for the real stresses of embroidery. When I work with these folks, if they're having a struggle, a lot of the struggle has to be that I've made something perfect on screen and it looks exactly how I want it. Why is it coming out so weird on the machine? Why can't it do the thing that it looks like it's supposed to do when I'm looking on screen? And this is the thing I talked about very early on. These folks have a tendency, however, to have a better kind of working understanding of color, a better working understanding of shape and line, and to understand the drawing portion of digitizing software very well. So that's the other kind of realm we can come from. So I talked about commercial and craft, but there's also this concept of embroidery to digitizing, where you embroider first and understand the medium first, or there's design to digitizing, where you come from the design world, you come from the drawing world and go into digitizing. And I think each of these has their own perils. Certainly as a digitizer, the thing is, you might come, if you're coming from embroidery, you may not stretch very much because you go directly to what's easiest to embroider first. And so some people who come through this kind of channel, when they design their own work or work on pieces, they really are strict with their measurements and things. They don't stretch very much in their embroidery. That's where we get a lot of the coloring book style work, because it works very well. It stitches very cleanly. Whereas these folks might have some difficulty because they want to design outside of the box for embroidery. But once they understand the medium, which is what they really sometimes hang up on, they have a tendency to then be able to design for it very well. But still will considerably increase the creative expression that they do in their embroidery, because they have a tendency to want to make something that they could do in print or that they've seen somewhere else and work out how it works in the medium of embroidery. Now, this is just my experience with dealing with these folks in classes. It can go a different way. It can go many different ways, but that's kind of the experience that I've had. And in teaching folks who work kind of vector or design first, I've even developed some segments here where I talk about the skills that translate. And like I said, a lot of the stuff that translates is they do great art prep once they understand embroidery. It's very easy for them to do redraws and things like that when they have to prep art. They have a tendency to understand things like Bezier curves and tools. Even if they work analog, they end up where they can go into these tools a little bit more easily, especially if they're vector artists already, because a lot of our tools, especially the modern ones, have a tendency to work very much like vector. Here in Stitch Artist, we have a complete ability to work like vector in Bezier curves. Not all tools work that way. Some digitizing software doesn't work in Bezier first, but there's Bezier level editing. And so someone who's worked in vector really can pick it up quickly. And then things like this. This is once again, Stitch Artist 3 has a path menu that allows us to do these transformations, addition and subtraction and outlining and things like that. If somebody's worked in Illustrator, this would be called the Pathfinder menu. And it's a very simple kind of way to punch out and work with shapes instead of doing hand drawing. Faster building and precision. The people who are doing vector art have a tendency to go there pretty easily. Things also like type layout tend to be a little easier for them to pick up as well. So yeah, it's something that you see pretty readily with people who are doing design first. They know a lot of these design basics and they kind of take that on a little easier. Certainly people who do craft and design work can also have, a little bit easier time with things like color management to a degree because they've worked with it before. I did an entire article about color management for images, but some of these things that really make sense to them that I had to work through myself as somebody who didn't work with color and design first. Things like when I was working on this rainbow blend where I blended all of these threads from one corner to the other of this little 2-inch K that's sitting here, I had to work on my color selections. If we look at it, it looks like a pretty wide gamut of color from this kind of purpley lilac-y color over to this yellow. But what I want to show you is that if you grayscale that out, you can see that though we have different values in the color overall, or different hues in the color values are laid out in such a way that the blending has a pretty easy way to get from the dark to the light, despite the fact that I'm changing the hue. And someone who's worked in art or worked in paint or print is probably going to have an easier time of that. And they also know things like the fact that relative color can shift quite a bit. This is just an example. The word color and the faux marrow border that's here in this piece is not changing from block to block. The only thing that's changing is the background color. And you can see that the perception of how yellow this C looks versus how yellow this R looks. And this is just on grayscale without being on top of another color that can mess with your color perception. It's still wildly different the way that top color looks just on those different backgrounds. I have a tendency to find people who do art first, can accept and see that and see the differences because of that relative color, maybe a little bit easier than some of the folks who start from embroidery first. Though I'm going to say this is not universal. There are some people who have better color sense than others. Whereas the other thing that's interesting, somebody like me who worked in embroidery first, this is, as you guys know, if you've seen this sample before, one color of metallic thread. Working with texture, working sculpturally can be easier for someone who started in the embroidery world because we have a tendency to understand that stitch angles change color perception, that textures change color perception, that change how bright something is, and that stitch length and texture can change not only the reflection in the color, but can change how bright, how smooth these textures look, and can give us a lot of depth and interesting shadow and light effects that may not be natural to someone who hasn't worked in a dimensional material like embroidery. And if they're working on things that have lots of different stitch angle changes, or that are utilizing those stitch angle changes even in one color, they may want to shade more with colors or additional colors and shading runs. Whereas we who work in embroidery first might be more likely to use texture and stitch angle and things that are natural to embroidery as a medium in order to notate or to increase kind of the visual the visual impact of a piece, or to just literally give us some different colors to work with, right? So some things that are interesting about those two pathways, but like I said, I think they all have pros and cons. They have things that are valuable to them, but everybody comes to it with some kind of their own baggage, but their own baggage is also their own influence. So we have baggage, like I'll say about my commercial world, I tend to work on efficiency first. I tend to use stitches a little differently, and I want to be a little lighter in the hand overall, and probably do a little less processing. Somebody in the craft world, however, they're going to be more creative. Because they're more willing to work on that software, on execution, they may do more processes to a piece than I would in a commercial space, and they may be more willing to use more color in their piece because they're not thinking about the efficiency as the top ranked thing that they're worried about. And they're going to stretch a little bit more as far as materials as well, because they're more used to working with idiosyncratic materials and different fabrics than someone who, like I said, I started out making golf shirts all day. I made golf shirts and woven shirts and jacket backs pretty much all the time. That is what I did. Hats, jackets, shirts all day in just a few kinds of materials. Certainly learned what the different materials did, but it was more standardized than someone who comes from the craft enthusiast market, someone who comes from the fiber art side of this. And certainly, funny enough, I'll say this, someone who comes to embroidery first may make judgments based on what they think is possible with embroidery, whereas someone who comes from art and design first might assume that embroidery can do a thing and probably push the embroidery a little further than someone who starts from the limitations of embroidery and works out. So I think we all have a place here. And in learning digitizing, we all kind of have different ways we can go about it. So we got a few comments that I'm going to grab real quick. And then I'm going to go for kind of the final thing, which is just talking about some learning modes and why I think they're important. And then we'll get out of here for the day. But got some people in. Jesse's in. Hi, Jesse. Happy to see you in today. Ramona saying hi to everybody too. Everybody's talking about that stuff. When Joanne says by craft, do you mean home market enthusiast? Yeah, kind of. I do. I think that it's home market can be there, but I'm also kind of putting fiber artists in that place too, because there are some people who I would consider probably to be on the art side more than the craft side. But when they come into it, they tend to be in that same boat of being willing to use materials and stretch. But they come more from the design and art side into embroidery as a medium. They use embroidery as a medium specifically. Whereas I think craft, it's more likely that you might use, stock design, stock materials, do projects according to a recipe. But I find that more people, even on that side, even when they're taking recipes that other people have handed them, they're more willing to say, hey, I'm going to take this piece, I'm going to just delete this chunk of the fill and then throw a piece of applique underneath it. And the material that I have is what I have on hand or something cool that I found, and I'm just going to try it. I find that the craft side of the world is more likely to do that than the commercial side of the world. Certainly, then the fiber artists are going to be very expansive with the way they make marks, very expansive with the way that they use materials, because their entire goal is the aesthetic and or meaningful representation of some subject using fiber arts. That may be their entire goal, or at least a large portion of their goal. Crafters are making an object for either their own use or someone else's use. Maybe they also might be semi-commercial, kind of in a craft commercial market where you're doing craft table, selling goods in that fashion. And in that way, they have a consumer for the good, whether that's themselves or a family member, or like the craft table, they're working toward a consumer. But part of that is they want to engender that sense of novelty and say, hey, here's this cool thing that we want people to work with, right? So here is an interesting thing that I want to make because I think people will be interested with it and kind of, buying that thing. And part of the way I'm going to do that, how am I going to separate my work from somebody else's? Because they may not be digitizers just to start with, they are more likely to use materials, colors, threads, applique material, mylar films, other things like that, or to buy kind of what I would consider a higher process designs, things like fringes and foams and things that where you have more process cut work, added beading or rhinestones, things that though they might work in the commercial world, you might find in the commercial world, they're less likely, especially in the business to business kind of uniform style work that I was doing. So yeah, so that's what I'm kind of talking about. So Joanne says, yeah, I was wondering if you would say an artist is on the craft side. More like it. If I look at a spectrum of aesthetics first versus, like I said, maybe efficiency is the best way to put that. The artists are furthest out in the way of just like, I am using whatever it takes to make the thing that I'm envisioning. And they may do things that are to the commercial eye would be even wrong-headed. They're making a design where they're intentionally, scrunching up material on the top of it because they want texture, something that you wouldn't wear because they're making an art piece and that is a statement thing that is part of what they're trying to do. They're making marks in a way that's really kind of out there, but it means that they're very expansive with their usage. Craft folks want things to run very well. They may or may not be cool with that much deformation or all these different interesting ways they're handling things. I mean, don't get me wrong. The fiber arts people can be very precise and very clean as well, but they might be more expansive in their use of materials and what they're willing to do with their software and stuff. And they also are going to be more likely to get into digitizing so that they can make unique marks and make their own vision. Craft folks might be using more stock designs, might be using, also they're doing probably recognizable graphical work that is a little more normal, but they will use more materials that is interesting, right? So they will tend to be more willing, in my experience at least, to use different materials and to get out there and do more project work that's a little bit more hands-on. So boutique embroiderers in the commercial world are similar to this too. They're going to work with materials that might take more handwork, that might take laundry, that might take cutting or post work once something is done. Like I said, the fringing, that is much more likely in my experience to be seen in the craft world than in the commercial world, where really the concept is you get a garment in, you run it on the embroidery machine. The post work is maybe trimming, removing of stabilizers, steaming, and packaging. That's about as much post work is going to be done, aside from things like 3D foam where it has to be torn out. But then it's tear out the foam, hit it with the heat gun, poke in the errant fuzzy, and then into the box it goes. Not the kind of working with different materials and additional pieces that you might see, I'd say, in the craft or in the boutique world. So it's kind of this spectrum for me where, though I'm using artists and crafters and commercial people to kind of explain it, it's more that there's kind of a spectrum between what is aesthetic and what is efficient. And you can kind of go on that spectrum in any of these ranges. Because I've done things that were commercial work that took a lot of post-processing, that required me to do laundry on the pieces. But they were very much more retail and fashion styled, and the margins were really high. If I were doing it for uniforming, it wouldn't go. If I'm doing business to business uniforms and patches and work shirts, it doesn't go that I'm going to have to launder something 2 times, render it something that you can't return, cut into the garment necessarily. Now, don't get me wrong, reverse applicating stuff exists in the commercial world, but it is less likely than someone who's doing something that's super artistic. And we're less likely to do an individual piece that has handwork or lots of post work into it. But that's the thing. This variation has now kind of changed as we have people taking different tracks from the art world, from the craft world into the commercial world. As we're seeing designers become their own fulfillment centers, I'm seeing some of that, if not break down, soften. Those boundaries that we used to have between what was craft and what was commercial, between what was artistic and what was efficient, are breaking down a little bit. And they're becoming more permeable. And I think that's a good thing. But it does explain how we might have a certain kind of initial startup setting. Let's put it that way. Our default settings as digitizers, since part of what we do in our interpretation, a great part of it, is what happens between our head and our hands, not just what happens in our software. Our default settings as digitizers may change depending on where we start, depending on where we came from. So that's something that's interesting, right? A couple more comments before we finish this out. We have Amy from Volk Steamworks here. Very interesting topics. You have a great journey story. Thank you. Thank you for sharing connecting topics. Thanks. Yeah, love to share that stuff. And like I said, really depends. Really depends. Lisa says, good afternoon. Going to catch a replay later. You have some great insight. Thank you, Lisa. Lisa, by the way, another educator who, though I will say she works in what some people consider the craft or home market, she definitely has a concept of efficiency and how to make things connect well. So educators can be all across the board. Lisa does some really creative stuff, but she also does some creative stuff that you wouldn't see me do in a commercial side of things, because it is more in the craft or home or enthusiast market. These are all good. Like I said, none of these are value judgments. And I love the work that she does. Like one of the things I think about is in the hoop work or lace work. really rare for people like me who do commercial stuff. Does it occur? It does occur. A friend of mine did lace ornaments that he used for commercial work. You guys may know him who is a listener, who's Jeff from the Embroidery Nerd. He did some lace ornaments, and I've done lace work commercially as well. However, is it rare? Yeah, it's rare. Whereas Lisa did some really awesome lace earrings and some other freestanding pieces that are beautiful. And I don't think they're that much post work, but it's more post work than you would see in a business to business sense, and more creative. So, like I said, go check out Lisa's stuff. She's got great work that is very creative and interesting. Like I said, that explanation, it's not that it changes what we're capable of. It does change maybe where we come from first. What's our first instinct, right? My first instinct is to reduce color, reduce detail if I can, if it's something that I think is detrimental to the embroidery, to make sure that something runs cleanly, simply with the fewest number of color changes, jumps, and trims as possible. That's how I tend to work first. So my work tends to be a little bit cleaner, but maybe a little simpler. And also my graphical style where I come from, I love retro styled work. You guys have seen that I really get into vintage patches and vintage commercial embroidery. My vintage sensibilities, plus the fact that I tend to work very kind of clean as far as efficiency goes, means that my work is probably a little simpler, but it tends to be pretty clean, right? It tends to be fairly clean. And when I do shading, I'm very consistent and careful about things like my shading and my colors. I tend to keep them at a level that I think is going to run well and run cleanly, run quickly. So interesting stuff there, right? Like I said, it's not that you necessarily have a boundary around it. I've done animals and detailed work and freestanding lace and all of that stuff. And in fact, some of it for commercial clients. Believe it or not, a few times freestanding lace for commercial clients. However, it's not the first thing I lean on. And certainly it's something that if someone was a bridal worker, if someone was a craft worker who did lace ornaments or lace work for collar pieces, lace work for fashion, they're going to be much more in tune with that and understand that much more deeply. And then also be fully willing to talk to customers about post laundering, etsing, cutout, things like that may be different to what I would do as a commercial person. In fact, I'll say this, a lot of my work, I was very frustrated at a period of time. I wanted to use materials that required post laundry, and most of my clients refused picking up a garment that had been laundered. Even if we laundered it in a way that was careful, it wasn't about scents or anything like that. The garment that had already been laundered to the point where it lost its finish, its factory finish, was something that most of my corporate clients wouldn't take. They didn't like a garment that had lost its sizing. And so that's definitely something that can frustrate you if you do stretch beyond it in the commercial world. So interesting things there, right? So last couple comments here. Elena says, I get that. I think I'm stuck between wanting to be artistic and not wanting to be crafty. It causes dramatic trauma. No, not a problem. I think the thing is we need to stop making value judgments about the difference between craft and art and the difference between commercial stuff and art. I think if we get to this point where we say, I want to create an interesting, visually impactful rendition of the art that's in front of me, and I may or may not use certain kinds of techniques from different places to make that happen. As long as between us and the people who are meant to wear these pieces, we have that understanding, I think it should be fine, right? I think it's the right way to be, to think that way. Elena says, great explanation, Eric. You give me a great insight on how to implement and where my thoughts are at the moment. Great to hear that. That's like the best. And by the way, Joanne says, love Lisa. Me too. Love her content. All right. So kind of thinking about those boundaries, right? It's to understand that they are permeable is good, because I think that as we go further and further into this, I'm watching people come up on TikTok who are Gen Zers who are making clothes now, and I'm watching them cut apart old quilts and sew them into hoodies and then do commercial style logos on them. The boundaries are changing. The definitions are changing, and they're always a little more fluid than we think they are. The good thing we can do for ourselves and for other people is to not make value judgments about these things and to try and stop ourselves from thinking that way. The other kinds of things I'm going to talk about just really briefly, you guys, if you want to go check out more of my articles, there's other episodes where I talk about the learning methods and the different kinds of ways we learn. Just to kind of make it clear, some of the things that you come across, documentation is the first way of learning. If your software has a great manual like we do over at in Brilliance, because Brian made a great deal of effort, put a great deal of effort and a great deal of his knowledge into writing the manual, then documentation can help. But there's also unofficial documentation like the classes that people teach that are not related to the software creator. Documentation, though, is useful. I consider third-party documentation, if you want to call it that. It's not documentation so much as just third-party articles and things, to be very valuable. That's why I've written them for years. If you're somebody who takes a great deal of inspiration from writing, from reading, and from listening to these things, then podcasts, I think, will also fit into there to some degree. But documentation, the official documentation from software, can absolutely help with digitizing. I think it's more important to get direct experience first. But even if you don't have that direct experience yet, if you're somebody who's listening to this right now and you don't have access to an embroidery machine, I would never tell you not to read all your documentation and not to get your experience in other ways. Go do documentation reading, go get direct education, and then try your darndest to find someone with a machine who's willing to run your files if you already have access to software, or to get yourself on a machine so you can get direct experience. Because I think it will never solidify unless you have all three. Read the information from people who have already learned the lessons and the information that's available for your particular tools. Know that stuff inside and out. It's always useful to know. However, benefit from direct education where you can get it. Go to a class like I'm teaching at the DAX shows. Watch this show. Watch Lisa's episodes. Watch the Embroidery Nerd stuff. Watch stuff from whoever is teaching, who's doing that direct one-on-one education. And if you can get to the point where you're at a live show, or you can talk to somebody and ask them questions live and get answers, it's incredibly valuable and about the quickest way you can solve problems if someone you're talking to has experience. And then, against all odds, if you're someone who hasn't had the chance yet, if it comes down to working in a shop or doing an internship, sometimes that is the way. But get direct experience on the machine and watch the interactions. If I could recommend one thing that has made the difference in my career, and I'll tell you, I have also done it the wrong way. I've decided that, hey, I know enough. I'm going to let a machine run and not watch this brand new thing that I made. And come to find out that I really should have watched it run. Experience things directly on the first time you run on new materials. If you're trying a new technique, if you're trying new settings, watch the design run, or at the very least do some swatch testing and watch the swatches run with your very eyes, every little stitch, and pay attention, because that direct experience is going to make a huge difference. And the other thing I'll say too is, the other thing I kind of tell everybody about kind of getting inspired, get out there and look at embroidery. Look at fiber art, look at the art that's out there, consume broadly, create with focus. Don't just replicate other people's art. Definitely don't be a knockoff artist. If you do replicate somebody else's pieces, that's great. Take inspiration from that and then make your own. Take little bits and pieces from all these people that you learn from and make your own thing. Then do the SMART cycle. Stitch, measure things that are wrong, analyze what's going on to figure out what's happening according to the knowledge you have of how stitches work. Refine it and test again. Do your SMART cycles, consume broadly, create with focus, watch what's going on out there. And these days, with all of the ability to look at all these different things that you can do to see everybody else's work, get out there and look at embroidery and look at fiber art. Get inspired, analyze, put it together, test it for yourself, get that experience. But whichever way you go about it, understand this, that those who aren't out there willing to try and wreck some fabrics and do the things that they need to do are going to have a harder time. The holistic education comes to and benefits those of us who step into the arena and decide that we're going to take the risk to mess something up and to have some failures, because failure is not fatal, but is almost always educational. And trust me, those who have gone before you have certainly failed enough that you can be forgiven for whatever you wreck. All right, folks. Though I had some other stuff I wanted to share, I'm going to leave it at that today. Went the whole hour and a half, wasn't intending to, but here's hoping that was something good for you folks to learn from. I like to share my experiences so that I can be clear and very honest with you about how it is. If you're going out to Kansas City, or you know somebody who might be out in the Kansas City area, I am teaching next week. I'm teaching on the 23rd and 24th. 23rd is the long piece where it's kind of a semi-intermediate, building on the basics of digitizing. If somebody's out there, go to daxshow.com. You can sign up still, and there are seats available to sign up for that class. If you want to see something about doing the analysis of designs, I actually have one on the 24th as well, a short session called Embroidery RX, where I'm going to talk about analyzing designs for things that go wrong from the perspective of a digitizer specifically. I'm teaching there, so that's going on in Kansas City. And if you missed that show, but you're somewhere else in the Midwest, I will be teaching in Minnesota soon, and thereafter in the Chicagoland area. You want to get direct education from me, Dax shows are where to get that. But until then, folks, probably won't be on next week. You may be going without me. I may try and do a pre-record if I can make it happen, but kind of fraught getting my way up to Dax this time around. Might not be able to get it. But if I don't see you next week, I will see you the next week after that. And I can't wait to have you guys in for another discussion Friday after next.